For the next few moments, what I'm going to do is talk about the end of World War I and how that really set up conditions for the Treaty of Versailles, which we'll look at later on. But we're really going to focus on the end of World War I and what is described as the Big Three, and that's Britain, France and the United States, and how they approach the end of World War I and what they want to achieve afterwards. I think it's important first of all to understand the condition of Europe and the world at the end of World War I. The war has gone on for a lot longer than people expected. Don't forget, when soldiers enlisted in Britain in 1914, many of them expected to be home by Christmas. Clearly that's not the case. The war has carried on till 1918. Millions of soldiers have been killed, millions of civilians have been killed. Particularly in northwest Europe, much of the industry, farms, factories and railways in France and Belgium have been destroyed. Britain has lost a huge number of men. Germany is on the brink of starvation and civil war. America joined the war in 1917. Now clearly the war has not affected them to the same degree. There hasn't been fighting in America. America's actually made money by selling weapons, by selling ammunition to European powers. However, they've also lost troops in the war. And it's a misconception to think that America did not lose a large number of men. America lost soldiers at a greater rate than any other power in World War I. Soon as they joined the war, they really committed to it. Therefore, everybody has been affected by World War I, but to different degrees. And that really sets up the conditions for what is known as the Paris Peace Conference, which in turn will lead to the Treaty of Versailles. And for this video, all I want to do is look at how the Big Three approach the Paris Peace Conference and what they want to achieve at the end of World War I. We're going to look at those in turn. We've got the leader of Britain, David Lloyd George, the leader of France, known as George Clemenceau, and we've got the leader of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson. We're going to look at each of those in turn to understand what they want to achieve. And we'll start with David Lloyd George. Now, David Lloyd George was an experienced politician. He's what could be described as a realist. He understood that Germany needed to be punished at the end of World War I. Particularly the population of Britain wanted to see Germany punished. Many families had lost relatives in World War I and they wanted to make sure that Germany paid for the consequences of that. However, David Lloyd George also understood that Germany was a key trading partner to Britain, and therefore if Germany was punished too much, the German economy would suffer, and that would mean that Britain couldn't trade with Germany. Therefore, he needed to balance a fine line between punishing Germany, but not too much. Also, David Lloyd George wanted to ensure that Germany didn't have a large empire. Don't forget, we're still in the time of the British Empire here, and David Lloyd George wants to ensure that Britain remains the most important empire in the world, and therefore he sees this as an opportunity to limit Germany's empire. So having looked at David Lloyd George, we'll move on to George Clemenceau. George Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France at the end of World War I. He really was known as being a ruthless politician. He had the nickname the Tiger. He was stubborn and he would not back down in negotiations. He wanted to make Germany pay. He'd seen Germany invade France twice now. Once in 1871 and then again in 1914. He wanted to make sure that would never happen again. And he effectively wanted to crush Germany. He wanted to make sure the German army was no longer capable of attacking France. He wanted to make sure that Germany paid France for the damage it had caused in George Clemenceau's country. He wanted to make sure that the French population saw George Clemenceau as seeking retribution, revenge against Germany. So he's coming from a very different position than David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was a realist. George Clemenceau is being quite harsh in what he wants to see happen to Germany. Finally, we've got Woodrow Wilson. President of the United States. Wilson could be described as an idealist. He wants to see this as an opportunity to end all war, to try and see a world where peaceful negotiations take place rather than resorting to war. It's also worth remembering at this point that he's coming from a very different position. America has not been hit by the same degree from the aftermath, from the fighting of World War I. And therefore he doesn't want to punish Germany as harshly. Wilson's view is, if we punish Germany too harshly, we risk another war later down the line. So Woodrow Wilson wants to punish Germany less harshly and wants to try and set up a world where there will be peaceful negotiations. Woodrow Wilson proposes what are known as the 14 points. The most important of those is the establishment of the League of Nations. The League of Nations would be a body, an opportunity for countries to come together and resolve their problems in a peaceful manner. The best way to explain this really is almost like a United Nations but version 1.0. It's an early version of the United Nations. So we now understand in very broad terms what these three leaders want. David Lloyd George, he's kind of trying to seek the middle ground. George Clemenceau really wants to punish Germany harshly. Woodrow Wilson, he's an idealist. He doesn't want to punish Germany harshly. He wants to see a peaceful world in the future. So with that in mind, it's worth now just looking at some of those disagreements that are going to take place between these leaders as they try and establish the Treaty of Versailles and how Europe will look after World War I. Now, as we look at these key disagreements between the big three, I want to look at them in three areas. And first of all, we're going to look at the disagreements between Wilson and Clemenceau. George Clemenceau really wants to cripple Germany. He doesn't want the German army to be in a position to attack France again. However, in contrast, Wilson doesn't want to punish Germany too harshly. He wants to allow Germany to be able to defend itself. He sees punishing Germany too harshly as a risk of causing a war in the future. Another disagreement we could look at is a disagreement between Clemenceau and David Lloyd George. Again, we look at this view that Clemenceau's taking, punish Germany harshly, strip its military power so it can't invade France again. However, David Lloyd George sees Germany as a buffer between Russia, which is a communist country, and the rest of Europe. David Lloyd George does not want to punish the German army too much because he sees that as one of the defences against communism. Another disagreement that Clemenceau and David Lloyd George have is that Clemenceau really wants to punish the German economy, really wants to make sure that Germany doesn't have the means to have another war in the future. However, Lloyd George understands if the German economy is punished too greatly, it means that Britain won't be able to trade with them in the future. Essentially, that will mean the British economy suffers as well. So there's a difference here. Clemenceau wants to ensure Germany pays for the damages and cripples the German economy. David Lloyd George wants to go lighter on the German economy and ensure that Britain can still trade with Germany. And finally, we'll look at a difference that David Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson have. Woodrow Wilson has taken the view that all nations in the world should have the right of self-determination. They should decide their own government. They should decide what happens to them. However, David Lloyd George recognises that this is a threat to the British Empire, and they disagree on this. David Lloyd George wants to ensure Britain maintains its empire. Woodrow Wilson wants to allow all nations of the world self-determination. Similarly, Woodrow Wilson wants to allow nations freedom of the seas. He feels that the British should not be able to dominate the seas. Britain is still a global superpower at this point. So a difference here is that Woodrow Wilson wants to allow every nation access to the seas, wants to allow nations to have their own navies, whereas David Lloyd George really wants to limit the navy of other countries, and he sees this as an opportunity in the Paris Peace Conference leading up to the Treaty of Versailles, and he will want to limit Germany's navy. So now we've looked at the big three, and we've got an understanding of the key differences between these three leaders. Tasks you could now do in your notes to help you cement that knowledge, to help you really understand this. First of all, create a mind map. You could create one explaining David Lloyd George, another strand covering Woodrow Wilson, and another one, George Clemenceau. A further example you could go on to, a further piece of work, would be complete a paragraph describing two differences the big three had whilst they were entering the Paris Peace Conference. Explain how David Lloyd George would disagree with Woodrow Wilson, or how George Clemenceau would disagree with Woodrow Wilson. A final thing you could do is write a letter from the perspective of one of these three leaders back to their home nation. What are they trying to achieve, and why are they trying to achieve it? By understanding the big three and what they're trying to achieve, it will help you understand the Treaty of Versailles and the ramifications of that later on. So there we are. That's the big three following the end of World War I. If you want further information, ask your teachers, look into the textbooks, but also subscribe to this channel. What I will do is I'll upload further videos talking through conflict and tension 1918 to 1939, and we'll look at some exam skills, drawing on the information